at the White House today. It has been Salman's second official visit to Washington, coming amid a massive corruption crackdown being waged by the Crown Prince. Joining us here now in Washington, the founder of the Arabia Foundation, Ali Shihabi. And in New York, co-host of Morning Joe, First Look, Ayman Moldeen joins us for this conversation. I think we should start off broad and talk a little bit. This is the second visit, obviously, about the global significance of the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Washington. Could you do that?
Well, it's very significant. I mean, the kingdom has a 75-year-old relationship with Washington. And at this moment in time, I think there's a meeting of minds on how to approach Iranian expansionism in the region. The White House just announced yesterday that they're going to be setting up a coordination committee between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the U.S., where the national security advisors will be meeting every month to coordinate their strategy. So I think that, it's at a very opportune time. At the same time, it's following up on the President Trump's visit last year to Saudi Arabia.
That was something. Yes.
That was something. And so I think the relationship is very solid, really, across the board.
So David Ignatius just back from Saudi Arabia.
Ali, I was just in the kingdom several weeks ago, had a chance to interview the Crown Prince. Two things struck me, and I want to ask you to comment on both of them. First, the passion that he expressed for changing the kingdom, changing the role of women, changing a lot of the things that we thought were unshakable. That's the first. The second, I was struck by the way in which this is a top-down revolution. This is being imposed by a very strong, I'd say headstrong, Crown Prince who's leading it. So talk a little bit about both pieces, the change agent and the top-down part.
Well, look, he's the first leader in 50 years that is taking on the conservative religious establishment. So it has huge significance for Saudi Arabia. It also has huge significance for the world of Islam, really, because, Middle Eastern leaders have been very reluctant. It's always risky to take on the religious establishment, the religious right, if you want. And so it's a very, very bold step, a bit risky, but bold and very necessary. And as part of that, he's taken a huge step in empowering women. Not just letting them drive, but bringing them into the workforce and really integrating them into the Saudi labor market. So it's hugely consequential.
His critics say he is autocratic and impulsive sometimes. What would you say in response to
David,
that?
to make such change in a country like Saudi Arabia, where the political spectrum is so wide between the extreme right wing and the left wing, you need autocracy to effect that change. You would not be able to do that in the time required and to the degree required if you didn't have a benevolent autocracy.
It is what it is.
Let me ask you about the corruption the anti-corruption campaign. As the Times has reported, there was a big crackdown. There was also torture that was going on at the Ritz-Carlton in Riyadh, as some members of the royal family and officials were held there. Reporters spoke to doctors. What do you think of that?
Well, there hasn't been any substantiated evidence of torture. I had a good friend of mine who was there, and I met him just a few weeks ago. And I mean, the whole process that he went through was what he said was very professional. He was treated with a lot of respect. He was, yes, he was kept to his room except for interrogations, but there was no physical abuse whatsoever. Now, could it have happened on an individual basis? Of course, nothing is impossible. But there really has been no evidence brought out so far to prove these sort of allegations. And these are just simply that, allegations.
We spoke to doctors, but yes, we spoke to doctors who saw quite a bit of
Well, we would need to have the details of who the doctors were and what exactly that torture was. Because, it's not, remember, if they wanted to torture people, they would have thrown them in dungeons or prisons. They would have put them in the Ritz-Carlton. So I think the whole idea of putting people in the Ritz-Carlton was that this was sort of a house arrest type of activity, but it wasn't a coercive use of force against people.
I'm going to send it down to Willie Geist in New York.
Yeah, we've got some people champing at the bit here. Ayman, I'll start with you. The idea that was just presented of a benign autocracy being necessary for the development of Saudi Arabia and progress of Saudi Arabia. What do you think about that?
Well, I think from a perspective of watching the change that the Crown Prince is trying to implement, you're going to have a younger generation of Saudis welcome the news. I think there are going to be questions of transparency, rule of law, whether or not some of the processes that the Crown Prince wants to try to implement are going to be just, going to be fair. Are they going to favor just a certain type of class within the Saudi establishment? So there are those that are the skeptics who are watching this and say, well, the Middle East has had its fair share of promises by benevolent autocratic rulers. leaders. There's no shortage of autocracy in the Middle East. The question is, will there be, given the backdrop of the Arab Spring, given the backdrop of populist desire for change and reform, will there be leaders who are going to see this and want to try to bring their populations along, or will this be, as we just heard there, a top-down driven change? Sometimes with a top-down driven change, you run the risk of alienating parts of the population, and sometimes you can become tone deaf to what the population actually wants, and that's the risk ultimately if you are just implementing the vision that you want and not the one that the society wants to participate in and go along for.
That's clearly what's happened here. This, the phrase is revolution from above. The danger is obviously that there's going to be tremendous pushback, factions in the royal family who feel cut out, he's going too far too fast. And also, where do the checks and balances come from? One of the biggest mistakes, I would argue, under this leadership is the war in Yemen. Yeah. This is significant strategic overreach. And the idea that he's trying to do all this domestically, at the same time he's taken on a war with Yemen, he's got a diplomatic war with Qatar. Where are the checks and balances? And whether you're talking about Xi and China or others, the danger right now for the Saudis, and I think for this clearly visionary or talented young prince, is where does the pushback, who's there to self-correct if and when he makes mistakes? And I think that's the real question.
Len, you want to try and answer that, Ali Shah?
Well, look, of course, checks and balances are issues.
Right.
But, it's not a question of having a menu of perfect skills at the moment. Mm-hmm. You need to have change. You need to have somebody who has the guts to do it. And you need to do it in a record time. And yes, of course, you're going to have resistance. But so far, he has taken power and he has effected so much change. There's been very insignificant, if negligible, resistance. There's been no bloodshed. There have been no demonstrations. There have been no domestic strife. So, I mean, so far, if you look at the record, he seems to have done a pretty good job.
Ali Shahabi, thank you very much from the Arabia Foundation. Very good to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Fascinating perspective. Ayman, thank you as well. We'll see you on Morning Joe. First look at 5 a.m. Eastern every morning right here on MSNBC. Elizabeth Bumiller and Richard Haas, thank you both so much as well. Still ahead, Donald Trump had The Apprentice. Now he has his own legal drama show. The latest reshuffling of the Trump legal team as Bob Mueller closes in. And Republicans see no need to formally protect the special counsel investigation, despite the president's constant attacks. Morning Joe is coming right back. We'll talk about all that.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.